This is the only lecture that we're going to be doing for Module 4. I'm sure some of you will be very happy since we had 4 lectures in the last module. But in this module, this lecture rather, I'm going to talk about slavery, freedom, and the Revolutionary War period in North America. So we're covering a period from about 1607. I'll backtrack a little bit and make some comparisons between the English, the Spanish, and the French colonies in 1787 or 1789. We'll take a look at the Revolutionary War itself. We'll look at the emancipation, what some people have called the first emancipation, in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War. And then we'll talk a little about the Constitution and how the American Constitution of 1789 deals with the issue of slavery. The objectives for this lecture are, number 1, to compare the development of slavery in the English, the Spanish, and the French colonies, to explain the impact of the rhetoric of revolution on African Americans and on slavery, to explain why African Americans joined both the Patriots and the Loyalists, and to identify the ways in which the Constitution of 1789 impacted the status of African Americans. In this module, you're looking at chapters 4 and 5. For the lecture, I'm going to pay particular attention to chapter 5, and I'm also going to go back to chapter 4 and make some comparisons, small comparisons, between the English colonies and those in the Spanish and those of the Spanish and the French. In chapter 4, however, your author is looking at the development of institutions, African American institutions, in the British colonies in North America. So he's looking at things like, or they are looking at things like family life, Christianity, methods of resistance, running away, for example, rebellion, contesting labor. In the section on religion, I'd like to just mention just 1 or 2 things because religion is a theme that we're carrying all the way through through African American history. And you've already done a discussion on religion in Africa, the coming of Islam into West Africa, and the relationship between Islamic and traditional religious beliefs and practices in West Africa. And one of the things that you were discussing was this whole issue of what would it feel like or what would it be like to be an Islamic slave in a Christian society in North America. The authors in this chapter point out that Africans clung to religious practices, traditions, and values of their homelands. The thing that makes, or the situation that brings about the greatest change in this clinging to African traditions and values was, of course, the First Great Awakening of the 1700s. Great Awakening preachers in their preaching style and in their sermons appealed to Africans. The ways in which they conducted the sermons appealed to Africans. Great Awakening beliefs or practices, in particular those that were the preaching styles and the sermons of the Methodists and the Baptists, were more passionate and emotional. Preachers encouraged things like dancing, chanting, shouting, clapping, and singing. And as your author points out on page 89, he says, quote, "For the first time in the North American colonies, slaves encountered a worship style that reminded them of African spirituality." Now, this did not mean that all African slaves adopted Christianity by the 1700s. What the author is trying to say is that Africans resisted Christianity initially because it didn't seem to connect with them. It didn't make sense with the overwhelming majority of Africans who were brought in as slaves until the preaching style and the sermons changed, until you moved away from the kind of traditional style of the Puritan minister who stands above the congregation and preaches down to them, but still speaks over their heads in a way. or the more formalized religious traditions of groups like the Anglicans or the Catholics. And you get to the Methodists and the Baptists, who are talking more to the person, who are speaking more to the person rather than to the religious tradition itself. At that point, because Africans could make connections between what they remembered of the way in which religion was practiced in Africa and the way in which they're hearing it in North America, you begin to see more and more conversions, more and more practices, more and more Africans practicing Christianity. Some, however, did not adopt Christianity. And your author uses as an example the Muslim slave Yaro Mahmoud of Maryland, who held on to his Islamic traditions way into his later years. Mahmoud had been brought to North America as a slave. He eventually gained his freedom. He lived a long life into his 80s, living in Maryland. And your author mentions that people could remember seeing this old Islamic slave just wandering the streets of Baltimore, singing praises to Allah. Now, that is an image that is kind of unusual if we think about it in terms of what we would think American colonial traditions would be like, or what American slavery is like. The chapter also talks about these methods of resistance, and I would like you to really focus on two things. One is that your author is not just describing resistance as rebellion. He's going to begin to point out in this chapter and later chapters the slaves resisted slavery in any number of ways. Running away was a form of resistance, of course. Rebellions like the Stono Rebellion, and please be sure to focus in on the Stono Rebellion, was a method of resistance. Contesting labor arrangements were methods of resistance. So we'll come back to these methods of resistance when we talk more about slavery in the next module. I'd like to go back and just make a few comparisons before we move on into the Revolutionary War period, and in a way set the stage for the Revolutionary War period by taking a quick look at some comparisons between slavery in British North America, slavery in the Spanish colonies, and slavery in the English colonies, the French colonies, because you will begin to see changes in the geography, the map of North America in a sense, in terms of who's going to control this continent, but also in the way in which slavery is going to be practiced, because it will become, the continent as a whole will become more and more under the influence of the British and then later the Americans, as these other colonial powers are squeezed out of their influence on the continent. So let's take a quick look at the British colonies. By the 1750s, I'm not going to go back and look at what we talked about in the previous module, this development of slavery, but what is it going to look like by the 1750s? And this map is a very good example. I hope you can all see it, the comparisons that they're making in terms of population. Slavery existed in British North America in all of the colonies, although the percentages of the population in each colony, of the enslaved population in each colony, tended to vary. And you have these, of course, the variations from, if you look at New Hampshire, look at Massachusetts, look at Connecticut. These are colonies where slaves represent maybe 2% of the population. And then you look at Virginia, where slaves are representing over 40% of the population, and South Carolina, where the black population is 61%. South Carolina is going to be the only colony that has this black majority. So slavery exists in all of these colonies, but the percentages of the population vary. In terms of the sources, for North American slavery, they tended to be saltwater rather than transshipped, meaning that these are Africans who are coming directly from the coast of Africa, rather than being brought to the West Indies, and then shipped to North America. This was particularly true by the 1750s because of the changes that were taking place in labor conditions or who were the laborers in North America. By the early 1700s, you're seeing fewer indentured servants were coming in. And you're seeing, after the changes in terms of the Royal African Company losing their monopoly on the slave trade, you see more and more Africans who are being brought into the colonies. So that you have kind of a reinfusion of African traditions and culture and values when you have this larger group of Africans who are coming in the early 1700s. Colonies began to develop stricter laws in the 1700s in relation to slavery. There was more of a public acceptance of brutal treatment in the colonies as a way of suppressing or controlling the slave population. Increased hostility toward mixed marriages, so that if you think back to the videotape where they were describing the situations of Anthony Johnson and his family, there were less of these possibilities for slaves to interact with indentured servants, and there was less acceptance of the idea of mixed marriages among slaves, among Africans and Europeans. The increase in the slave population came through natural increase in North America rather than through this continued infusion of Africans, although we do see an infusion of Africans, a larger number of Africans coming in the early 1700s. And then finally, the laws on slavery varied from colony to colony. In the other chapter, they talked about how slavery had developed in the colonies. And what becomes very clear is that in the American colonies, depending on where you are, the way in which slavery is going to be practiced in the first place depends on where you're located. But slavery will exist in all of the colonies. You've got some differences, though. If you look, for example, at the New England colonies, like Massachusetts, which actually passed the first law recognizing slavery, slavery is going to be very different from the way in which it's going to be practiced in the Chesapeake colonies, like Virginia. In all of these colonies, what you begin to see, or what you have seen, is a transformation from indentured servitude to chattel slavery, starting in the 1640s. In 1641, Maryland recognizes slavery. In Massachusetts is followed by other states which also recognized slavery soon after that. Connecticut in 1650, Virginia not till 1661, then Maryland, New York, and New Jersey. In 1640 in Maryland, you have in Virginia, you have the Punch case, making that distinction between blacks and whites, black indentured servants and white indentured servants. In 1662, Virginia passes a law providing for hereditary slavery. Children inherit the status of their mothers. 1664, Maryland passes what's called the first anti-amalgamation law, which meant that white women who married slave men were to be enslaved during their husbands' lifetimes, and then that their children would be slaves as their fathers were slaves. So you've got kind of a contradictory idea of inheritance here, because in 1662, Virginia had said children follow the status of their mothers, but in 1664, Maryland says except when the mother is a white woman. And then you have children who are following the status of their fathers. In 1667, Virginia passed a law which made Christian baptism, which said basically that Christian baptism would not affect the status of blacks or Indians. Up until that point it had. You've got some restrictions on free blacks, and you can use the story of Anthony Johnson and Emmanuel Rodriguez as examples. Virginia makes it illegal to free a slave by 1691. Slavery becomes associated with race then. If you're English, Christian, white, you're free. If you're African, you're considered heathen because being Christian will not make a difference as to whether you become slave or free, or whether you become free rather. African, heathen, black, slave. By 1705, slaves are considered real estate and chattel property. Real estate in the sense that they can be bought, sold, deeded, willed, passed on from one generation or one person to another. And chattel in the sense that they are considered personal private property. By the 1700s, slavery in the British colonies is hereditary and it is racialized because it is a status that only Africans or people of African descent can have. Now the question becomes, why African slavery in North American colonies? And this is tied very closely to another question, why not the other sources of labor? Why not white indentured servants? Why not Native American slaves? Why is the choice made, or the decision made, kind of a historical decision, that it will be African labor? Well, it has to do with what is happening with these other two sources of labor. In terms of white indentured servants, number one, they could not be permanently bound. Number two, they have ties to home. Number three, there are growing opportunities in England for poor people and less of a motivation for them to come over, to give up everything, and to decide that they will, in a sense, mortgage their freedom for 7 years to come to a wilderness to start all over again. They can just stay in England and earn a living. And there's also a concern in the colonies for this growing population of poor, landless people, in the sense who are coming out of indentured servitude at a time when there's less land that needs to be cultivated. For Native Americans, there are problems. I guess probably the most obvious problem is that they know the land better than some of the settlers, so they can hide places that probably the settlers couldn't. They also have connections with Native American populations, sometimes with very powerful Native American populations in the interior. And colonies have to negotiate with Native American populations to keep peace on the frontier. And then finally, why African slavery? This is happening at a time in the late 1600s. These other two factors in terms of white indentured servants and Native Americans, the whole structure is changing at a time when there is an end to the Royal African Companies, the RAC, their monopoly on the slave trade. So there is an opening up of the profitability of slave trading. And there's a perception at the same time that Africa has an unlimited supply of labor to give to this new world. Now, if you look at the chart, the graph rather, on the other side of this, you'll see that this importation of slave labor from Africa goes through some cycles, like business cycles, in terms of the numbers that are imported. Sometimes it's very high, sometimes it's very low. In the 1700s, it's kind of an up and down thing. In general, what we see is that it's steadily rising from the 1720s to about the 1750s. Then you see a dip from 1751 to 1760. Then it's rising again, probably rising again 1761 to 1770, which just so happens to kind of correspond to the end of the French and Indian War and the changes in the geography of the continent as France is pushed out. So you start to see more opportunity, or Americans perceive that there's more opportunity. And then about the 1770s, it drops and continues to drop. From 1770, this is the pre-Revolutionary War period. And what we don't see here is what happens after the revolution. More or less from the 1730s to 1776, the slave trade, the African slave trade, had been pretty brisk, except for that slight dip that you have from 1741 to 1750. It had been pretty stable, steadily going up, and then it drops somewhere around the early 1770s. The trade slows down during the Revolutionary War, but if we could see on the other side of this graph that we don't really have the information for, what happens after the war is that the trade picks up again. After 1783, after the war ends, and it's pretty active until 1808. And then in 1808, we're going to have a constitutional provision that calls for the end to the slave trade. In 1789, we have the constitutional provision that calls for the end to the slave trade by 1808 or 1809. So the trade will end, but what we see in the 1700s is that slavery, black slavery, is more acceptable, it's more profitable, it is seen as the labor supply for the southern colonies in particular, it is widespread. Now in the Spanish colonies, just to kind of recap what we've seen already, black slavery developed in a very different way in the Spanish colonies. Remember that blacks came with the Spanish from the very beginning of their voyages. The slave trade began in the early 1500s, and it is a slave trade to all of the Spanish colonies in the Western Hemisphere. But the big difference is that slavery had a place in Spanish law, that it did not develop as the English did. It was always there in what we call the siete partidas, or the 7 parts, and that the slavery that exists in Spanish law defined the slave's rights and the master's obligations. You don't really have that in the English colonies. It's more of a trial and error thing. Whatever's going to work in terms of protecting the white population and exploiting the labor of the black population, that's what you're going to have in terms of the British colonies and the slave codes. Slaves did heavy labor, but they also served as soldiers, guides, and linguists. They were treated more humanely, although you remember from the last lecture, I'm not really sure that I would tend to go along with your authors on this, because slavery is never going to be humane. I think what they mean is that there was more of a recognition of the humanness of the slave, as opposed to just simply seeing the slave as property. There were opportunities for freedom, for slaves to gain their freedom and then to become citizens. There were opportunities in the British colonies to gain freedom if you could purchase your freedom, or you were given your freedom in the will of a slaveholder. But that did not necessarily mean that you would be guaranteed full citizenship. Remember the situation in terms of the family of Anthony Johnson, who are free blacks, but rather than seeing themselves citizenship opening up to them, what they see is that citizenship, in generation after generation, the access to citizenship, to all the trappings of citizenship in the British colonies, are shrinking. In the Spanish colonies, there's a recognition of personhood. In the English colonies, not necessarily. Part of this difference in the Spanish colonies has to do with the religion, that the Catholic Church is the sole religious authority for both the master and the slave. Whereas in the English colonies, you've got a variety of religious traditions that tend to recognize not the religious authority of one central church, but the religious authority of many different institutions, religious institutions, in different ways. In the Spanish colonies, the way in which slavery existed, the character of it is going to be shaped by climate, crops, size of the black, white, Indian populations, interactions between these populations. Again, it's described as a more humane system, but slavery could be harsh. Slaves were treated very poorly in some places, overworked in areas. And there's also European competition in the Spanish colonies that sometimes tended to benefit the blacks. And a good example of this in this chapter, chapter 4, is the description of Fort Mose. Fort Mose was the first black town in North America. It was founded by a man by the name of Francisco Menendez, who was an African slave who had been born in a Mandingo village in West Africa about 1700. He was transported to Florida in the 1720s. He was freed in 1728 as a reward for bravery in a battle with the English. He became a soldier in a free black military unit of the Spanish and built a town on some land that was given to him by the Spanish government. The town, Fort Mose, was about 2 miles north of St. Augustine, the city of St. Augustine. Fort Mose became a sanctuary for Africans who were fleeing South Carolina slavery. And all they had to do, in a sense, according to the Spanish, was just cross over into Spain, Spanish territory, and they would be given asylum. And Fort Mose was the location that many of them were trying to get to, this free black town. This constituted, of course, a threat to English authority. And the English continually attacked Fort Mose, drove the people out of the town several times in early 1740. Menendez and his people would come back and just rebuild it. But in 1763, after the French and Indian War, the Spanish gave Florida to the English, and Menendez and his people eventually just packed up everything and moved their community to Havana, Cuba. Now, there's a little connection here that I want to make between what is happening in terms of these English colonies in South Carolina and what is happening with Fort Mose. In 1739, when you have the Stono Rebellion, so this is, of course, in South Carolina, those slaves who were involved in the Stono Rebellion were trying to get out of the British colony of South Carolina and make their way to Fort Mose in the Spanish colony, but they were captured before they were successful. So the result of this, 1740, is that the English will attack the town of Fort Mose and try to run the people out, but they'll keep coming back. In the French colonies, generally speaking, in New France, they had very little use for slaves in French Canada. But as the French colony began to spread into the Mississippi Valley, it began to expand into the colony of Louisiana, then there was a growing demand for labor. France established a presence in the southern part of their colony around New Orleans. Eventually, the black population by 1731 had grown to 4,000 slaves, or about a 2-to-1 advantage, African to white French. By 1746, they were 3-to-1 African to white French. Those who settled, those Africans who were brought by the French into Louisiana, came primarily from the west coast of Africa in the Senegambia region. They were Bambara, and they were brought in primarily because they knew how to cultivate rice, and rice was the principal crop that was being produced in this region, in the lower Mississippi Valley. In the French colonies, there was also a greater tolerance for racial mixing in the early periods of the development of Louisiana. And in fact, the French had different names that they would assign to every degree of mixing in their colonies. African men, Indian women were referred to, the children of African men and Indian women were referred to as griffs. There was intermingling between French soldiers and African women. And from that, you began to develop these terminologies for racial mixing that range from mulatto to quadroon to octoroon. However, in 1724, the French Code Noir, or the Black Code of 1724, forbade intermarriage. Now, that's very different from intermixing. Racial mixing is going to continue. But what is said in this code is that these arrangements cannot be formalized into legal marriages recognized by the church or by the state. The population of New France grew very quickly. If you look on page 85, there should be some indication of how this population is growing. Okay, now let's skip ahead to the intersection of all of these different colonial traditions. If you look at this map on the left, you'll see how America looked in 1700. You've got the English clustered right along the Atlantic coast. You've got the Spanish around Florida. You've got the French all the way from the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lake region, all the way down the Mississippi Valley and extending all the way on the other side of the Mississippi River, well into close to Spanish territory, in Spanish again around New Mexico, and a huge unexplored area in the American Northwest. All right, that's America by 1700. And that's America on the eve of the French and Indian War. Then, of course, you've got a warfare, conflict, that breaks out. Actually, you have a series of wars, 4 wars, that have been going on for decades between the French and the English and the Spanish and most of Europe at that time. One war after the other. Most of these wars generally started in Europe, and then they pretty much filtered over to any areas in which these European nations had contact with each other. So that you've got one war, the one that precedes the French and Indian War, that is bubbling over in the colonies. And you've got the French and Indian War that actually starts in the colonies and then spreads back to Europe. French and Indian War begins in 1754 and continues to 1763. It is the war that's known as the 7 Years' War in Europe. But in America, it's the French and Indian War. In the aftermath of the French and Indian War, which the the English win, the whole map of North America changes. The first thing that happens is that the Spanish lose their territory in Florida. They have to cede this territory to the British. The French, on the other hand, give their territory between the Mississippi River and the mountains. They give this territory, which they had controlled, Louisiana, they cede it to the Spanish because the Spanish had helped them during the French and Indian War. They had been allied with them. They also don't want to give it to the British because they weren't particularly fond of the British after this war, of course. So if you look at this map then, you've got this cluster of British colonies right along the coast. Then you've got this huge interior area, which is, in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, controlled by the Spanish. Britain has to change its policy after the French and Indian War, its colonial policy, in 2 ways. Number one, they have to adopt a policy that will help them to govern this huge, vast area, territory that they've just acquired. And then number 2, they've got to figure out how are they going to financially support this territory, as well as their empire that has grown all over the world. So they decide that they're going to make everything, all of the British Empire, they're going to make it pay for itself. So if you're a colony in North America, you're going to be put on the same basis of contributing to the treasury of the British government as those people who are living in England. And of course, that means that you're going to be taxed in the same way. In North America, what is also going to happen is that in order to govern this new territory and to kind of suppress rebellions among Native Americans on the frontier, the English are going to draw a line called the Proclamation Line of 1763, and they're going to tell the colonists, American colonists, that they cannot go beyond this line. Part of this most of this is to manage this new territory that they have. They're saying you cannot go any further than this new territory. Of course, the Americans had always thought that they would now be able to move into this territory because they had helped the British to acquire it. And I think I just made a mistake earlier. The Spanish have been pushed to the Mississippi River. They have all of that land on the other side of the Mississippi River, but it includes Louisiana. If you look at this map on the right, what you see is that the English have those settled colonies right along the coast, but then they have everything else from the Appalachian Mountains, that Proclamation Line, to the Mississippi River. A huge area. Look at how their lands have expanded from that small dark green area on the first map to all of this land on the second map. So they have to figure out how are they going to govern this new area. Now, almost immediately after they passed this new ordinance, the American colonists began to challenge it. By the early 1770s, there's growing opposition to the British regulation and taxation. They will not pay these taxes. Most of you have covered this in your American history books, so we're not going to go through it in great detail, but no taxation without representation becomes a common phrase. And it's based on the idea that the colonists are saying, we are not represented in Parliament, therefore Parliament has no right to tax us. We're represented in our state legislatures, therefore they can tax us. The colonial legislatures can tax each of their colonies, but not British Parliament. You begin to see descriptions or analogies between the way in which the colonies are being treated and the way in which slaves are treated. The British colonists are saying, England is treating us like slaves. They are tyrants. They're treating us like slaves. Now, part of this rhetoric kind of filters over to the black population, and the analogies do not escape them. They're saying, okay, well, if it's wrong for Britain to treat the colonists in this way, shouldn't it be wrong for the colonists to treat us in this way? You also have some of the leading revolutionary speakers like James Otis, who make this same kind of connection in a pamphlet called The Rights of the British Colonies. He affirms the right of African Americans to be free in the same way that other British colonists are claiming freedom. Abigail Adams, who was the wife of colonial patriot John Adams in 1774, made the same point when she said, quote, "It always appeared a most iniquitous scheme to me to fight ourselves for what we are daily robbing and plundering from those who have as good a right to freedom as we have," meaning the slaves. Free blacks like Crispus Attucks also challenged the authority of the British. In 1770, he joined this colonial protest against the British authority that kind of spilled over into what became known as the Boston Massacre. And he was the first American to be killed at the Boston Massacre. In 1774, the Continental Congress passes an agreement that they will not import any slaves after December 1st of 1775. Now, we shouldn't think that they were trying to do anything for the slave population, because this particular non-importation of slaves is tied to a whole series of reactions that the colonists are having that are kind of folded into what's called the non-importation agreements, and they were put in place after the Boston Tea Party. In 1774, the colonists go on board this ship, dump this tea into the harbor in Boston. The British respond by passing what's called the Intolerable Acts, closing the port of Boston, among other things. And the colonists respond by calling their Continental Congress together and by saying, okay, we are not going to import any more things, British goods or whatever. And we're also not going to import any more slaves. Thomas Jefferson publishes a pamphlet called A Summary View of the Rights of British America, in which he states that the abolition of slavery was the great object of desire of the colonies, but it had become increasingly difficult for the colonists to abolish slavery because Britain blocked colonial efforts to end the slave trade. It's kind of a convoluted way of thinking, especially for a Virginia planter. Jefferson also was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. And in drafting the Declaration of Independence, he included a clause that was somehow left out of the document, the final document, but he included a clause. The Declaration, of course, stressed all these ideas about natural rights and self-evident truths and all of this. And Jefferson, in this omitted clause, stated, first of all, he says, and in this case, you should think about who exactly does he mean by he. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights and law of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people. Obviously, at this point, he's talking about the Africans who never offended him. And let me back up. He is the King of England. Captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. And he's talking about the slave trade. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Now, he wasn't finished here. Then he goes on to say about this King of England and what he's doing. He takes it a step further. And I think to really understand this, I'm going to ask you to go back and pick it apart. What you have on this one frame is one sentence, which makes it a little bit difficult to understand. But if you pick it apart, you'll understand exactly what Jefferson is trying to do here. Okay, first of all, he says, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he, meaning the king, has prostituted his negative, or his veto. The king had the power to veto legislation from the colonies. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. In other words, he has refused to stop this trade. He has refused to use his veto power to stop the trade. Then he goes on, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished death, in other words, that the slave trade couldn't end, and slavery itself, he, the king, is now exciting these very people, the Africans, the slaves, to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he deprived them by murdering the people upon which he also obtruded them. In other words, the king is encouraging the slaves to rise up and fight against the very people that he forced to maintain slavery. Again, a little strange for a Virginia planter. Thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. Now, if it wasn't really clear what I was trying to say with this, go back and pick this sentence apart and know that he refers to the king. The trade, the commerce, is the slave trade. And what Jefferson is suggesting is that the king is encouraging slave rebellions. He's encouraging the slaves to rebel against the American colonists as a way of paying off the slaves in a sense. He hasn't done what he should have done in suppressing the slave trade, and now he's trying to use the slaves against the colonists. Okay, now what's going on in this war at this point? Well, the war starts 1774. Blacks are serving in colonial militias from the very beginning. They're at Lexington and Concord. it would seem logical that they would be serving with the Continental Army, but initially Washington rejected black soldiers in the Continental Army. The Continental Army is the army of the colonies. It serves all of the colonies. This is George Washington's army. And the key difference between the Continental Army and the state militias is that the Continental Army can cross state lines. So they might be fighting in Massachusetts, but then later they might be fighting in South Carolina. Okay, Washington says no black soldiers, no slaves, no free blacks in the Continental Army. Well, the governor of Virginia, the British governor of Virginia, has something else in mind. Lord Dunmore, who's the royal governor of Virginia, in 1775, organizes several hundred slaves who had escaped behind to British lines. They had come from the American planters, colonists, to the British lines. These slaves joined Dunmore, who, as he was trying to run away from Williamsburg, the capital of Virginia. And he organized these slaves, as well as some loyalists, Americans who remained loyal to the British government, and some British Army regulars, into a small army on Virginia's coast. He called the blacks in his army his Ethiopian regiment. And he put these blacks, this Ethiopian regiment, to work fighting against the Americans. In November of 1775, Dunmore issued a proclamation declaring that all indentured servants and slaves, black and white, who fought with the British Army against the rebels would gain their freedom. Now remember, the American policy up to this point is that they're not going to accept blacks in the Continental Army. Well, as soon as Dunmore issues his proclamation, then the Continental Army says, okay, we'll accept blacks also. Eventually, 5,000 of the 300,000 soldiers who fought in the Revolutionary War were black. Blacks served in every phase of the war. Some volunteered, others were drafted or served as substitutes. You could hire somebody to take your place, so you wouldn't have to go to war. There were only two, they were serving in mixed or integrated regiments or units, but there were two separate black units, separate black units, two from Massachusetts, one from Connecticut, and one from Rhode Island. Blacks also served in the state navies. Some blacks gained their freedom as a result of their service, either with the Americans or with the British. And when the war ended, thousands of blacks, slaves and free, left the United States with the British. The little map down in the corner gives you some idea of where they went after they left. Many of them left and went to Nova Scotia in Canada, and then from Nova Scotia they will eventually either go to England or they will go back to Africa, to the British colony of Sierra Leone on the west coast of Africa. Now, in the aftermath or during the war, blacks also began to petition for their freedom. At the same time, really, that states were granting or ending slavery. In Massachusetts, in January of 1777, slaves petitioned the state legislature for their freedom based on some earlier provisions, and this would eventually lead in 1780 to a state constitutional provision in Massachusetts stating that all men are born free and equal. After this state provision was passed to the Constitution, blacks began to take notice of it, and individually they started to petition state courts demanding their freedom based on that constitutional provision. Now, one person who did this, who waged this kind of personal battle to get her freedom, was a woman by the name of Mum Bet. She was the slave of a family called the Ashley family in Massachusetts. There's a picture of her, which is pretty much the same picture that you have here on page 111 in your textbook. While she was a slave of the Ashley family, they had treated her pretty badly, especially Mrs. Ashley. And in the years leading up to 1776, the husband in the family, Colonel Ashley, who was really active in the Revolutionary War rhetoric and everything, had hosted some meetings of revolutionaries. Now, Mom Bet was a servant, and she heard all the discussions about freedom and all of this while she was waiting on the table, serving the dishes and everything. And she was inspired by this fight for freedom. So she went out and she found a lawyer, and she and another slave by the name of Brom took their battle for freedom to the Massachusetts courts, and they won their independence. Soon after this, Mum Bet, Mum meaning mother or whatever, it was kind of a nickname for her, Mum Bet, changed her name to Elizabeth Freeman in honor of the fact that she was now a free person. Another slave, Quock Walker, in 1783, also sued for his freedom and won. And during the Revolutionary War, other blacks followed the example of Crispus Attucks by fighting with the Americans or helping with the Americans gain their freedom. Some of these were Salem Poor, who fought at the Battle of Charleston in 1775, Peter Salem, who fought at the Battle of Lexington, the Battle of Bunker Hill, Stony Point, and Saratoga, Prince Whipple, who accompanied George Washington, when he crossed the Delaware River in 1776, and James Armstead, who was a spy for the Marquis de Lafayette. There's a portrait of Armstead on page 105. Now, in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, northern states and southern states began to wrestle with this whole question of emancipation, freedom. What would be the status of slavery in this new United States of America? And we can almost predict what's going to happen if we look at the ratio, the populations of these states. If we look at the numbers of blacks in each of the state populations. From Vermont, where there are only 25 blacks out of 1,000 people in 1770, all the way to Rhode Island, 3,776 out of 58,196, all the way over to those southern colonies, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, where blacks make up a much larger percentage of the population, and where obviously they contribute a large percentage of the labor force in those states. As emancipation takes shape, this first emancipation takes shape in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, northern states pass laws ending slavery, but they don't necessarily end it immediately. Only Vermont and Massachusetts passed immediate emancipation laws. In the other states, emancipation comes about through a process of gradual emancipation. And I'll use the last two states as examples. In New York, New York legislature passes in 1799 a gradual abolition act. New Jersey in 1804 does the same thing. And this type of emancipation, as you see in New York and New Jersey and in the other states, provided that children who were born to slave mothers after a certain date, in the case of New York, it is July 4th of the year the law was passed, would be considered freeborn, but were legally required to serve their masters for periods ranging from 21 to 28 years before they would be officially free, before manumission would be effective. So if you're born on July 5th of 1799, one day after the 4th of July, then you are considered free, but you have to serve your master for 21 to 28 years. 21, I think, for women and 28 for men. Okay? So you're free, but you're not free. Now, what this means basically is that people who are born before this are not included under this law, that there would have to be some other provision or other law that is passed that will effectively grant them freedom. New York passed abolition legislation in 1817, freeing people who had been born before 1799. In New Jersey, the provisions of the law were very weak and they were very easily circumvented. Owners figured all kinds of ways to get around this emancipation law of 1804. They did not free their slaves who were born before 1804, obviously. And they looked at those who were born after 1804 were, of course, assured of remaining slaves for at least another 20 years. The way in which New Jersey slaveholders sometimes got around this was that in that 21 to 28 year period, they they figured out how to sell their slaves to the Deep South to continue to make the profits. Just because the state legislature had passed the law did not mean that the slaveholders in the state approved of it. And they were losing a great deal of profit because slaves were valuable during this period. So they would simply find an owner and spirit the slaves away to the South and sell them. New Jersey passed a more stringent slave emancipation law in 1812, but these violations still continued. Other provisions in this aftermath of the Revolutionary War, provisions related to slavery, concern slavery in the territories. And the Northwest Ordinance was provided for the elimination of slavery north of the Ohio River. There was a provision in this Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that there was to be no slavery or involuntary servitude in the Northwest Territory, which would be the territory west of the Appalachian Mountains, north of the Ohio River, and east of the Mississippi River. There was no such provision in terms of what would happen in the Southwest Territory, the territory south of that Ohio River. And of course, that would be the territory that would include Tennessee and Kentucky. In 1787, an effort was undertaken to revise the original Constitution of the United States, the Articles of Confederation. In drafting this new Constitution, there were provisions made in terms of what would the status of slavery be, and what would be the responsibilities or the rights of slaves, if there were any, or slaveholders. There are 3 sections of this new Constitution of 1789 that deal effectively with the issue of slavery. The first of these concerns representation in Congress, and that's the famous 3/5 compromise. If you just take a look at the Constitution in the appendix of your textbook, you can go through and see what each of these provisions requires. The 3/5 compromise in the original Constitution provided that representation and direct taxes would be apportioned among the several states included in this new union based on some tricky figuring. And the figuring would be that you would count you would take the whole population of free people, and to that you would add 3/5 of the population of slaves or non-free people in your state. Now, nowhere in this provision or in any of the others that we're going to talk about do you see any mention of the word slavery. Right? In this 3/5 compromise, which is in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, you simply say the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, meaning indentured servants, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. So slaves are simply described as all other persons. In Article 1, Section 9, you deal with this issue of trade. And in that section, you have the provision of the slave trade compromise. What this said very simply was that Congress would have the power to abolish the slave trade, the importation of labor. They would have the power to, if we read the whole thing, the migration or importation of such persons as such and such and such. Here they're referred to as such persons. Right? That could be regulated, but it could not be regulated until 20 years after the document was ratified. And then finally, in Article 4 of the Constitution, which deals with the issue of reciprocity of state laws, there is this question of if you have a person who is bound to service for a person or in some way in one state, then that service is also recognized in another state. So whatever are the laws of one state, they are the laws of another state. And that will be the basis for passage of a federal fugitive slave law soon after the Constitution is ratified. Now, what does the country look like by 1800? By 1790, blacks were 19.3% of the population. Most of them lived in the southern states, had lived in the former southern colonies and the new states and territories south of the Ohio River. Virginia had the largest black population. South Carolina came next. Tennessee and Kentucky were not yet states in 1790, but the growing population in those states included slaves and some free blacks. In New England, slavery was declining as a result of the immediate emancipation in Massachusetts and gradual emancipation in other states. Cultural institutions like churches, black cultural institutions like churches, mutual aid societies, schools, were developing in the North as well as in some urban areas in the South. By 1800, African Americans were 18.9% of the population. They were nearly 50% of the population in the slaveholding states of the South. The majority of blacks by 1890 were native born. Therefore, it makes a lot of sense, if you think about it, that states would have approved this idea of abolishing the slave trade because the majority of blacks in the population are native-born blacks. The slave trade is not accounting for the increasing population of blacks in this country. It is from natural increase. Tennessee had become a state in 1796. By 1800, the population in Tennessee included over 91,000 whites, over 13,000 blacks, and 309 free blacks. 13,000 slaves, 309 free blacks. Okay, we'll pick up with this for the next unit. I'll try not to make the next lecture quite this long, but we'll pick up with looking at slavery in the antebellum South in the next unit.